Colleagues, good morning. Can we all hear me?
We can hear you.
Thanks, Doc. Good morning. Apologies for the delay. Let's just wait. I've been trying to scan through our presenter here. This is room 2, Inclusive City and Affordable Housing. We are expected to have 4 presentations. Mr. Hockett, I believe he's here. Yes. Professor Joseph Kamjaji. Prof, are you here? Prof Kamjaji? I don't know if Prof is here.
Let me try to connect with him.
All right. Dr. Rose, Dr. Ayanga, Dr. Mrs. Oh, I can see Prof Kamjaji, but I think he's muted. Prof Ayanga, are you here?
I think Kamjaji is here.
Okay. All right.
So you want me to get hold of who? Dr. Ayanga?
Okay, I can see Dr. Mayani here, also here.
Yes, I saw him.
For now, colleagues, once Mrs. Ngobese comes around, she's supposed to chair this event, but so that we do not delay, I will take over, cover for her present time. Mr. Gbemi Alalade is our co-chair for this room. And just like I mentioned, our focus on inclusive city and issues around affordable housing. So all the presentations that we have here are quite interesting and informed and speak to various diversity as regards to inclusive cities and housing. Our first presentation this morning will be from Mr. Hockett. And Mr. Hockett is a lecturer in the Department of Urban and Regional Planning, University of KwaZulu-Natal. He's a registered town planner with SAPLAN. Mr. Hockett also has interest in his research interest focused around economics, resilience, issues around integration, and is also a member of ISOCAP also. His presentation topic focuses on mixed housing designs, urban sustainability nexus in cities and the global south, perspectives of inclusive city from flare-off neighborhood city of Johannesburg. Mr. Hockett, over to you. You have the next 30 minutes. So your presentation is 20 minutes for each presentation and each presenter. So you have till 11:49. Then the other will come back for 10 minutes to a question. Over to you, sir.
Thanks. Good morning, Dr. Bulo.
Good morning.
Let me just quickly try and share my screen. It's fine. Colleagues, can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see your screen. Thank you.
Perfect. Okay. If it's no problem, I'm just going to delink my video for now. I'm just a bit hesitant regarding my connection. So let me just stop the video for my presentation, and then afterwards for the Q&A, I'll switch on the video once again. Okay, great. Good morning, colleagues. Good morning, Chair as well. I'm sure she will join soon. So thank you so much for the opportunity to present our research here today, colleagues. And I do hope that you find value in what we've done so far on this topic, and that we can, in our own small way, contribute to the discussion on creating inclusive cities, which is, of course, the theme of the symposium, and also open a discussion on some of the housing challenges which we look at in this room. We hope for a fruitful discussion and knowledge exchange as always. Thank you once again. So I trust you are well during these challenging times. I hope everyone is keeping safe and staying healthy. As Dr. Papula mentioned, my name is Okkert Pretorius. I'm a lecturer at the Department of Aboriginal Planning at UJ. The topic I'm presenting on here today is mixed housing designs and urban sustainability, and nexus in cities in the global south, with perspectives on inclusive cities from Vliehof, city of Joburg. Since submitting this topic of discussion to the organizers, the design in the title has been replaced by development to appropriately reflect the theme and scope of the research. For consistency, I've kept the wording of the title the same as the one submitted. The co-authors include Prof. Trinus Gumbo from UJ, as well as Dr. Immaculate Ingwani from University of Venda. So the primary theme of this research, as can be identified in the title, is how mixed housing development may potentially contribute to inclusivity and urban sustainability in cities in the global south. A core theme now is to determine the relationship between these concepts in the face of mounting challenges in the urban milieu globally, and of course in a developing country context. Examining Vliehof mixed housing development in Johannesburg, South Africa, in this regard is the primary aim of this research. But of course, I'll unpack this going forward and the progress that we've made in this regard. So the layout of the presentation is quite straightforward. I'll provide an introduction overview, provide insight on our research problem, the questions and aim, delineate our conceptual framework focused on inclusivity, urban sustainability, and mixed housing development. And this is followed by an overview of the methodology. The findings inherent to this presentation at this stage are garnered from undertaking a systematic bibliometric review of related themes. So that's a primary focus of the findings so far in our research and in this presentation. And I'll discuss a way forward for the research from here, including the actual analysis of the Vliehof case study going forward. So, of course, it's important to contextualize this research and provide an introduction and a broader context that has influenced, the rationale of this specific study. So research regarding urban sustainability is of increasing global importance in the face of challenges relating to globalization, environmental degradation, and urbanization. Initiatives to support urban sustainability is particularly pronounced in countries of the global south, which have seen significant urban growth in recent decades, a trend which is likely to continue. And continued urbanization presents fundamental challenges to residents and policymakers in cities of developing countries, as we've seen with the plenary discussion this morning. We have environmental impacts, social questions represented by increased demand for services, etc., as well as economic needs inherent to the creation of employment opportunities and sustained and resilient economic prosperity. So cities in the global south are faced with significant population growth, with the built environment tasked with addressing the symbiosis between human activity and the environment, whilst being challenged by inefficient infrastructure, urban sprawl, unsustainable resource utilization, significant land cover change, and somewhat lack of basic service delivery. So in responses to the challenges of urbanization in the cities of the developing world will determine whether global urban sustainability objectives are attained, which manifests through social inclusion, economic well-being, and environmental quality within our cities, while minimizing negative external impacts without passing the burden to the future. So appropriate local interventions in the built environment and human settlements are central to fostering urban sustainability. So this is evident in the objectives inherent to the new urban agenda, as well as the sustainable development goals, with the latter emphasizing the need to make cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. With that broad context, let's take a look at the South African background to the study. And in South Africa, urban environments are characterized by significant informality, fragmentation, continued urbanization, and spatial divisions, which is a legacy of apartheid spatial planning. In the post-94 era, housing and human settlement policy has been implemented to, with the objective of fostering spatial as well as socioeconomic transformation through the provision of well-located, affordable housing in close proximity to economic opportunities, social amenities, and formal service delivery. So in this context, it's important to note mixed housing development is seen as an important instrument to achieve these objectives. This is a core theme in housing policy. A specific example would be the Integrated Residential Development Program on a national level, and some megacity projects that are driven by provincial governments. So inclusive development and cities, as is the recurring theme, enable equal access to socioeconomic opportunities in a secure environment, including housing and employment access, ample public amenities, open spaces, adequate service delivery, as well as heightened mobility and access. So broadly speaking, mixed housing developments are characterized by heterogeneous housing typologies, medium to high density residential layouts, the provision of public amenities, and unique neighborhood designs. So a prominent mixed housing development is Vleerhof in Johannesburg, Gauteng, which is a private sector development supported, of course, with significant partnership with government, not only through the implementation of select housing programs. So mixed housing development is as an important human settlement intervention in the South African context. So based on this broad context and the South African background, I want to delineate the research problem, the questions and the primary aim that has guided this research so far. So we've seen on the previous slides of the presentation, there's significant need for spatial transformation in the South African context, but also the broader developing country context to equip urban areas with current and future, well, for current and future challenges. As significant capital, it may be financial or otherwise, have been invested in mixed housing development, it's of utmost importance that the targeted objectives of fostering inclusivity and urban sustainability in a fragmented spatial milieu is achieved by related interventions. However, importantly, there is some uncertainty regarding the actual effect of mixed housing development on urban sustainability objectives, whether it may be social, economic, or environmental. And getting clarity on this relationship is central to the research. So 3 research questions have really guided our research thus far. So the first one is, what is the relationship between mixed housing development, inclusivity, and urban sustainability? To what extent has this relationship, very importantly, been studied in the developing country context? Okay. And what is the interface between mixed housing development, inclusivity, and urban sustainability in the Vleerhof mixed housing development as a case study in the Global South? So the primary research aim is to inform human settlement policy, to contribute to achieving urban sustainability objectives in the Global South. So further investigating the role of mixed housing development and inclusivity in urban sustainability may contribute, of course, to achieving this aim. Right, so with the problem, the questions and the aim delineated, let's move on to discussing the main themes that constitute the conceptual framework of the research, namely urban sustainability, inclusivity, and mixed housing development. Considering the time constraints, I'm just going to provide a brief overview of these 3 primary concepts in our research. The first one is urban sustainability. So as stated in South Africa's SDG 11 report, the increased emphasis on sustainable cities and communities is etched in the paradigm of sustainable development. We want to foster sustainable development. As seen in the diagram on the right, which I've included in the slide, sustainability, particularly of the urban variety, is based on the interaction of various concepts, including economics, politics, ecology, and culture. More specifically, for the purpose of this research, sustainability of urban areas is determined by the ability of these urban areas to foster, to offer resilience and adaptability to external disturbances, such as economic or environmental shocks, adaptation, of course, to a coming environmental shock in the form of climate change, access to adequate housing, basic services, integrated transport, urban growth that considers the needs of the environment, the undertaking of disaster risk management, efficient waste management, clean air, and ample public spaces. So these factors that I've just mentioned also forms the basis of measuring progress with SDG 11 specifically. In terms of inclusivity, as alluded to in the previous slide, inclusivity forms a core part, of course, of urban sustainability. On a spatial front, which is of particular importance in South African cities, inclusive spaces, inclusive urban spaces rather, are planned and developed to ensure all are close to economic opportunities and transport systems to eliminate the exclusion of any segment of the population to provide them with more opportunities. Okay, so that's the objectives that we are working towards. So that is connected to economic inclusivity or inclusion, which refers to the equality of opportunity for all members of the society to participate in economic life of their country or city. So urban environments should foster economic inclusion that unlocks the potential of more and more individuals, as well as that of communities, empowering them to improve their circumstances and welfare. Social inclusion and cultivating a sense of belonging have been identified as important components of social sustainability as well. So relevant themes here include equity, social justice, democratic government, social inclusion, social capital, and quality of life. Right, so the last core theme of our conceptual framework to lay the foundation of our research is about mixed housing development. So broadly speaking, mixed housing developments are characterized by heterogeneous housing typologies, medium to high density residential layouts, and provision of public amenities. But these, of course, differ with context. Also referring to, or rather also referred to mixed income housing or integrated housing and various other phrasings. 4 dimensions that could be used to distinguish between approaches to mixed housing development include number 1, the allocation, which means the proportion and the range of incomes included in projects are taken into consideration. Proximity, referring to the spatial scale at which mixing of income is undertaken. Thirdly, we look at tenure or the financial mix, whereby the proportion of housing units to be rented out is considered in comparison to the proportion of housing units that are, well, bonded housing units or units to be sold. And the last one is the duration, referring to the amount of time projects remain mixed income based on funding restrictions, if that is a component of implementation of these developments in the specific context. So these dimensions are also referred to as a socioeconomic mix, spatial mix, as I mentioned on the slide as well, financial mix and temporal mix, respectively. In the South African context, mixed housing development is seen as a means of ensuring the desegregation of human settlements, contributing to social integration, bringing about communities characterized by a combination of income groups and cultural backgrounds. It is also seen as an instrument to stimulate spatial integration, eliminating the physical barriers to employment opportunities for previously marginalized section of society. So placing low-income households in areas with easy access to economic opportunities and employment, increasing household income and encouraging upward mobility and increased standard of living. So that's all the objectives associated with mixed housing development and associated ideas. So this is in line with the fundamental socioeconomic objectives of government. However, questions surrounding adequate access to affordable education and medical facilities for lower income households that's included in these developments, as well as the lack of well-located areas for the provision of affordable housing and access to facilities and opportunities as per the needs of the mentioned households, highlight some of the potential issues in literature of mixed housing developments. So this forms part of the objectives of this research to really determine the link between mixed housing development, and urban sustainability, with the potential to highlight both the positive and negative effects of this intervention based on the unique South African and the broader developing country context. So, taking a look at our methodology with the conceptual framework that I just provided, we adopted a phenomenological case study research design, which seeks to closely explore the complex phenomena that characterize lived experience of people, critical to explaining how they interact and make meaning of space. All right, so implementing a mixed method approach. The first part of the data collection and analysis is done through a systematic bibliometric review, the findings of which is the theme of the remainder of this presentation and reflects the status quo of the research thus far. And this includes a quantitative, replicable, systematic review of related literature to triangulate evidence from primary sources in line with our research objectives. So in this process, a Scopus database was utilized from which relevant data was exported, and these include publications that include the keyword mixed housing development and related phrasing in the title abstract or identified keywords in these publications. So these papers and
Mr. Oket?
Yes.
You have less than 3 minutes now.
Excuse me? Sorry, Doc?
You have less than 3 minutes.
Less than 3 minutes?
Yes.
Okay. In that case, I think maybe I should jump forward to some of our core findings, but I'll incorporate that. Thanks, Dr. Pula. Sorry if I'm going to go over the time for a minute or two. So as I was saying, these papers and their data form the foundation of further analysis that include determining the occurrences and linkages within this body of work. And that's how we sought to determine the link between the themes relating to mixed housing development, urban sustainability, and inclusivity. And we utilized Bos Viewer from Van Eck and Waldman. And the second part, which I'm not going to discuss in today's presentation, is undertaking interviews and actually undertaking this phenomenological case study at Vleehof with the face-to-face interviews with spatial planning experts and residents of Vleehof. But for now, we focus on a systematic bibliometric review. So this is the first page of our findings of the review. And we highlight prominent journals. Apologies, colleagues, I'm just going to be a bit more brief in my discussion. It indicates prominent journals, it indicates the prominent authors, and also indicates the number of publications under mixed housing development. And I want to jump to the core finding of this slide, is that themes relating to inclusivity and sustainability, you'll note on in the table on the right, have relatively limited occurrence and linkages with publications on mixed housing development that form part of this bibliometric review. Right, so this slide provides a broader network visualization of the keywords associated with mixed housing development research. There are 4 broad clusters of research in this space, in mixed housing development space. We have social themes like disability, psychology, accessibility, economic themes such as organization and management and homelessness, which obviously there's interaction between the clusters, but it's the broadly identified clusters. Another one is housing policy, which looks at social housing, housing conditions, and then we look at housing development, which include residential development, affordable housing, etc. So those are the broad clusters that are identified in the mixed housing development literature. Within this body of work, sustainability has primary linkages to housing policy and housing development clusters. With inclusive housing is linked to the socioeconomic themes. It is also evident that there's a limited and mostly indirect linkages between sustainability and inclusive housing, which will be further visualized in the next slide. For the sake of brevity, I just want to highlight that within mixed housing development, the discussion surrounding sustainability is connected with all 4 of the primary research clusters, which includes the socioeconomic 2 clusters, the housing development, as well as the housing policy clusters, where the clusters of, or the linkages of inclusive housing, the theme of inclusive housing in the mixed housing development literature is limited more to the socioeconomic research clusters like psychology or accessibility and disability. A very important finding that I want to highlight is this slide provides an overlay visualization of all the keywords, indicating through the color scheme which keywords have gained prominence over time. So we can see here through the color coding that sustainability and inclusive housing has gained more prominence recently from 2014, 2015 onward. And so it's also evident that most of the themes in the housing policy cluster has grown in prominence recently when talking about mixed housing development. So these preliminary findings may be related to the implementation and growing significance of the Sustainable Development Goals in the context of SDG 11 and the interlinkages between housing policy, mixed housing developments, inclusivity, and sustainable objectives. Just very briefly, this slide illustrates, well, it provides a slight change of angle in our analysis, including the occurrences and linkages in the spatial context of existing mixed housing development. So evidently, research on mixed housing development has been focused on the developed country context with keywords that include Europe, Canada, France, Australia, United States, with relatively limited reference to spatial context in the global south, including developing countries or developing world, with specific reference to South Africa and India.
Thank you very much, Mr. Oket. Thank you very much. Maybe we could capture many of your findings by the time they start asking the questions.
All right,
but
perfect.
To save time, maybe
right.
We could quickly go ahead. Thank you very much. Just before I hand over to Mrs. Ngobese, I did mention earlier that our chair for this section is Mrs. Ipilele Ngobese. Fortunately, she was able to join us now. And I'll hand over to Mrs. Ngobese to further coordinate the question section, which will take us 10 minutes. Please, just a reminder to our presenters, our presentation time is 20 minutes and time for question is 10 minutes. Over to you, Mrs. Ngobese. Thank you.
Thank you so much to my very able co-chair, Ayobami. Just to introduce myself, maybe I should turn my camera on. And if I can be excused, there's a bit of construction going on in and around where I am. So if you happen to hear sound, just my apologies in advance. And also my apologies for being late to the space. There were a bit of technology challenges, but we prevailed and we are here now. So we have just heard from the first speaker. If I can just confirm with you, Ayobami, is the idea that we take each input and then questions related to that input and then only move on to the next speaker. Is that correct?
Yes, that's what is stated in the program. The program says there's a presentation, 20 minutes,
so,
then 10 minutes question.
Okay, so just the next 10 minutes, taking us to the top of the hour, we can engage with this input that we've just heard from Mr. Pretorius, which really just drew on quite many dimensions of housing as they link to the inclusive city, and also sharing some of the gaps in that, there's a limited explicit interaction with inclusion when it comes to issues of housing and, gap housing and informal housing as well. So without taking up too much time as the facilitator, I will just perhaps open up the space into the room to hear what some of your questions are with regards to the input that we've just had. I'll also be looking out on the chat for any of your questions. So please feel free to drop your questions into the chat or raise your hand for a verbal input if you would like. So any takers at this point? Okay, Yanga, we will take your hand. Thank you. Please come through.
Sorry, I'm muted. Thank you, Chair. And thank you, Orchid, for your presentation. I was quite enjoying it. I'm very sad that we didn't get to see the other part of your findings. So in fact, the question I'm asking is to give you an opportunity to give to share with us those other findings that we didn't get to see. I'm very interested in understanding what you found to be the relationship between mixed housing developments and inclusivity.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
And specifically to understand, so I mean, I guess the broad question is how inclusive and are these mixed housing developments, and in what ways are they inclusive? In what ways do they remain non-inclusive? So I would like to have that, just a bit of detail about what exactly you found about inclusivity in relation to mixed housing development. Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks a lot. Thanks for the opportunity. Firstly, let me just, as you requested in your question, let me provide a quick, just a few pointers on the conclusions that we reached. I think that will answer some of your questions as well, but also contextualize our current findings with what we also seek to achieve with part 2 of our methodology, which is the actual undertaking of that qualitative data collection in the sphere of development. So our first conclusion really, if I could provide a brief overview, is that there is limited research on the direct link between mixed housing development, urban sustainability, and inclusivity. So that's our first conclusion, is a limited research link between those specific themes. Secondly, of the research that has been conducted, a limited amount is based on the context of the Global South. So what we take from these two findings is they support our rationale for the research going forward, and it motivates further research on the study of this relationship between the mentioned themes in the South African and by extension the developing country context. And for us to really understand, for us as researchers, but also stakeholders in the housing space, to really understand that link between mixed housing development, sustainability, and inclusivity, that is the objective of our part 2 of our research. In actually undertaking that case study analysis and the qualitative data collection in clear of. Our third finding is that the very apparent transdisciplinary nature of the existing research on mixed housing developments. We identified 4 broad research clusters, which I mentioned in the presentation as well, from housing policy and development to socioeconomic factors or clusters. This is also relevant to the relatively diverse linkages sustainability has with other themes, albeit not specifically strong linkages. So this indicates the broad policy perspectives that ought to be considered, in our view, in the next phase of our research. When collecting data, when analyzing the qualitative data and going forward and measuring the potentially broad outcomes, is really having that transdisciplinarity or transdisciplinary approach based on our findings of the bibliometric review. And lastly, the research cluster of housing policy relating to mixed housing development is gaining prominence, including themes of sustainability and inclusive cities in the research years. And I mentioned that that may be correlated with the implementation, increased importance in achieving the Sustainable Development Goals objectives. Sustainable goals, specifically with reference to SDG 11 and the broader challenges facing urban environments in the Global South, as discussed at the beginning of the presentation. So, in short, speaking about the exact linkages between mixed housing development, urban sustainability, and inclusivity, what we at the current stage can say is that most of our policy directives in the South African context view mixed housing development as an instrument to achieve that inclusivity in social, economic, and socioeconomic integration, providing opportunities for increased welfare and upward mobility. But in our research currently, we see that link isn't as clear. There's limited research on that specific field currently, and that's what we seek to achieve in the second part, is really to do that phenomenological case study research in the South African context specifically, because we know there's various unique factors that influence urban sustainability in any context, be it culturally, politically, economically, and the ecology. And really to then in our second part to drill down on the specifics in the South African context. So that's what we know thus far.
Thank you.
And I'm sure Yanga appreciates that. I hope you're covered, Yanga, unless you have a follow-up question to that. I also don't see any other hands, so the space is yours if you would like to ask a follow-up question.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Chair. Yes, okay, I do have a follow-up question, because I'm wondering, in my mind, the very idea of creating a mixed housing development has to do with inclusivity. I don't see why else you would want to. So it's surprising to me that there is very little research done on it. Why do you think that is?
I think I'd like to emphasize the fact that we are looking at the relationship between three themes: the inclusivity and mixed housing development, as well as how that inclusivity inherent to mixed housing development actually influence urban sustainability objectives. So that's probably a core distinction that we're making from the existing literature, because we're taking it a step further. It's not just measuring the inclusivity of mixed housing development and the factors of mixed housing development that foster inclusivity, social, economic, etc., through the things that I've mentioned, the integration of social communities, income levels, etc., providing housing opportunities in this space and access to services. But also in the same way, how does that influence urban sustainability in the South African context? Because we feel there may be unique factors that influence that urban sustainability that we know now from a bibliometric review hasn't been explored particularly in the South African context. So that provides our rationale for further study. I'm not sure where I'm answering your question, Yanga.
I think you are, because I think yes, what I'm hearing you say is that because you have this tripartite view on this question, because you're not just looking at mixed housing development and inclusivity, your results should be judged from that tripartite relationship. That that perhaps if your research looked just at only at mixed housing development and inclusivity, perhaps there's a lot that's been done on that. But when you add urban sustainability, then the research isn't so much. That's what I'm hearing you say, right?
That's exactly right.
Yes,
and
so I understand.
Probably another level on top of that would be that tripartite relationship within the South African or developing country context as well. That also provides another layer that influences the available literature and the studies that have been done.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you. All the best with your interviews. I hope that you get really rich material. I think it's an incredibly important topic that you're exploring, and there's a lot there. Both sustainability, both the concepts of sustainability and inclusivity have become so current. That's what they're the buzz concepts of this time, and yet we're not unpacking them enough, I feel. We tend to focus a lot on what is inclusive and what is sustainable, and not asking really what is lost in that process, what may be lost in the process of trying to drive or embed inclusivity in housing. What may be lost? In what ways particularly historically marginalized populations, in what ways do they find perhaps that in being included, they're having to exclude certain parts of themselves That, you know, as you move into these different neighborhoods, that there are parts of yourself that are not allowed in there, and that you have to minimize and manage because they're not welcome in that inclusive space, and hence you may find ways, you know, that on the one hand, people perhaps you are driving inclusivity, but on the other, you may still be having quite a lot of non-inclusive practices and ways that are taking place. Thank you. All the best.
Thank you, Yanga. Appreciate it.
Thank you to both. Actually, that's a wonderful note to end it on. It just follows on very well to what we are about to hear from the next presenter. So thank you, Yanga, and thank you, Orchid, for a wonderful engagement there that really takes us deep into what it means to include. What are some of the assumptions about including, and what are some of the things that are in depth and fundamental to inclusion? And with that, I would like to welcome into this space our next speaker, who will speak exactly to this paradox that Usisianga has alluded to of inclusion. So Professor Joseph Kamuzanje will consider inclusive cities in relation to urban housing and disability, really looking to unmask the political economy of urban housing provision for people with disability. So really zeroing in on vulnerable groups and how the question or the paradox of inclusion manifests when we look at it through the lens of exclusion and vulnerability in urban settlements in cities. Just by way of a quick introduction of Professor Kamuzanje, he is an experienced rural and urban planner, a member of the Zimbabwe Institute of Regional and Urban Planners, with an illustrious career and experience, professional experience, having worked for the government of Zimbabwe's Ministry of Local Government in the Department of Physical Planning, among other areas. He has also illustrious international development experience with regards to consulting and having worked on projects in Zambia, Swaziland, Niger, Kenya, Sudan, and South Sudan. So I'm quite excited to welcome him into the space and hear what he has to present to take us deeper into the conversation. Without further ado, welcome, Prof. And please take us through what you have for us today.
Okay, thank you very much. For a moment when you were introducing me, I almost didn't recognize myself. So thank you very much for your kind words. And I also like to thank Orchid for the presentation. He's already set the framework for my small presentation. So Madam Chair, just let me share my screen. Can you confirm, Madam Chair, that you can see my screen?
Yes, Prof, we can see your screen. If maybe you can just put your presentation. Yes, we've got slideshow mode now. Everything looks good. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you. Let me also just try to switch off if I can. No, but I find it's okay. So thanks, Chair. Just a disclaimer. My presentation is not from a scientific research, as it were. These are just experiences that I've encountered talking to communities in both, especially in urban areas. I've also been doing a lot of work with KwaZulu-Natal University on disability and inclusion. So I just thought I would bring these things to the table, and then we can discuss as we go. So like you rightly pointed out, I think for me, it's about trying to understand what are the issues when we come to provide housing for people with disability. And I will talk about Zimbabwe as a case. So I think, okay, has already spoken about the Sustainable Development Goals. I also wanted to highlight the fact that even the Millennium Development Goals, really, they're basically about inclusion. And I make the point that the word inclusive appears more times than in any other word in the 17 SDG goals. And I think that's a statement that we are making. The challenge is, how do we actually make sure that there's inclusion, not only in housing, but in other urban services? There's a lot of literature I think the Vancouver Declaration of Human Settlements talks about prioritizing disadvantaged groups. And UN Habitat, for example, is also like one of the proponents of inclusivity in terms of urban settlements. But I thought that before we talk about those things, there are also a number of issues that we need to, so I'll just go through them. The first concept for me, which is really interesting, before you even talk about housing, it's about just the right to the city. Who is supposed to be in the city? I know the South African and Zimbabwean history are almost the same, because there was a time before independence for both countries where an African, for example, needed a permit just to get into an urban area, not let alone even talking about access to housing and other services. So we really think that it is important to try and understand that the housing is just a small component of the issues that we have to deal with here. And I also make reference to not only the right to the city, but also to social justice, and to understand that the right to the city and social justice is a quite sometimes conflicting scenario, because what is one's right may actually impinge on other people's rights. So how do we resolve those issues? The right to housing, I think perhaps that's the main meat of my presentation. So the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights advocates for the right of everyone to have adequate standards of living, food, clothing, and housing. These are basic needs, and the continuous improvement of living conditions. And I think what we then need to do is to say to ourselves, what is actually happening in our context in Southern Africa as far as this issue is concerned. What we see is actually degradation of housing and housing services. More slum settlements, no water, no roads, no electricity, all these things that actually make it very difficult for people to have the housing that they deserve. But the issue is really, when you look at people living with disability, they are more affected than the general population. And I also make the point that women are particularly affected because of historical issues that we find. The next issue that I wanted to bring to the fore is universal design. So what universal design simply says is that we must not consider disability as a special condition of a few. But also, what it also then says is that if design works well for people with disabilities, then it works better for everyone, because you are trying to understand and address the interests of the most vulnerable and the most fragile. So once you are able to address housing for people with disability, you're actually going to also, with the same stroke perhaps, address the other needs for the people that consider themselves to be able-bodied. So the last question, I think, was about what do we do with inclusion. So I put up a diagram there which has got four squares, and inclusivity is in the middle. So the first one is we must make sure that housing is just accessible, okay? But if it is accessible, it must be affordable. So it's one thing for housing to be accessible. If people can't afford it, then it becomes a serious challenge. It's about sustainability, but both in terms of design, in terms of structure, but also resilience in terms of the communities that require housing, for them to be able to pay for the services that they enjoy. So I think this is an important thing. The question is whether and really how many of these quadrants can we address to be able to say we have inclusivity. The argument is that we need 4 of them. There could be more than 4. The argument is that we need to have the 4 of them working together. The reality on the ground is that maybe most of these are non-existent in the communities that we work with. So I then move on to perhaps a few of the issues that I think are critical in terms of housing provision. And the first one is really the policy and legislative framework, because that is the basis for any housing development, for any provision of services in urban settlements. So if you take Zimbabwe, for example, we've got a Disability Act, which is almost 50 years old now. And obviously it has run its course, it has become irrelevant, and it has become so difficult to implement because the situation has changed a lot. At the same time, for example, we've got a new constitution which was passed by Parliament in 2013. The Constitution and the Disabled Persons Act are not in tandem, so they don't speak to each other. And already we've got a serious problem because you don't have the framework to start understanding, but also to start addressing the needs and requirements of people with disability. I think for me, a very interesting one, and this is an issue that I leave to the researchers who are here, it's really about reliable data. I've always asked myself, how do we plan when we don't have, first of all, when we just don't have data, and when we have the data, when the data is not reliable. So for the guys that are on the forum, just to ask, do we even know how many people really are in the settlements that we plan for? But out of those people, how many are living with disability? And can you disaggregate the levels of disability so that you can understand if it's about housing, what type of housing they require? So for me, it's a really important thing. And I think in Zimbabwe, we've got serious challenges with just getting data, but getting data that is relevant, that is reliable, and that is disaggregated to a level that it can be used for the lowest levels of planning. So we've got really a big challenge here. The next point that I just thought I would touch on is access to finance. So the so-called able-bodied people are finding it very difficult to access finance. I think this is not a situation that is just in Zimbabwe, where banks don't have any financing that really addresses the needs and priorities of the poor. The interest rates are so high, we've got serious fluctuations with our currencies, you know, a plethora of problems. But the situation is even more difficult, I think, for people with disability. In every bank that you move into, they are talking about collateral. So if, you know, first of all, these guys don't have collateral, they don't have a formal employment which gives them access to funds that the bank can leverage on in case of failure to repay the loans. So this is a key problem. And the cost of building materials, the quality of the building materials, these are issues that perhaps we still have to try and understand how they affect inclusivity in housing provision. I've already touched on issues to do with gender. This is a critical issue. What we know is that both in rural and in urban areas, women face a serious challenge just to access basic services. And the situation becomes even more acute when the women are in urban settlements, which are really not friendly, not only to women, but to women with disability. And I think it will just be interesting for the panelists to go to the local authorities and get a waiting list and see how many women are there, and then try to disaggregate it further in terms of disability. I think the last point, Madam Chair, that I would want to talk about is housing and estate design, the actual house itself. We've got a serious challenge, and people normally talk about offices and our inability to address the challenges that people with disability face when they want to access services at institutions. I think that we've got a much more serious problem within housing, because it's very rare to see housing designs, especially in the poor neighborhoods, that actually accommodate the needs and the priorities of people living with disability. So, Madam Chair, like I said, I just wanted to bring these issues to the fore and to perhaps to start a discussion on whether we are actually promoting inclusivity, or because of the way that we are doing things, because of the policies that we have, because of the institutional degradation that we are facing, we are actually promoting exclusivity in housing provision. So, so in my conclusion, I make a few points. First of all, it is important to understand the fact that housing is a basic human right, and everyone is entitled to having housing of their own choice, perhaps almost even in their own in the location that they prefer.
Not sure if it's just me, but it seems Prof is frozen and we've lost his sound.
Yes, we have.
Okay.
Spelela, I will just try to call him. I'll call him now.
Okay, thank you so much. It was right on the mark and just coming to some very insightful closing remarks there. Hopefully we can get him back.
Over to you, Madam Chair. Sorry about the loss of network there, but I was almost at the end of my paper.
Yes, yes. And right on the mark in terms of time there, Prof, would like to commend you for that. And very concise and very insightful. What you said towards the end, particularly with regards to multiple exclusions that one might face if they are a woman in a city, if they are a woman living with a disability in a city, and how housing delivery can unlock or even limit the realization of the rights and all the things that can be the benefit of living in a city. Thank you so much for those inputs, Prof. I'd like to open the space for reactions, impressions, questions, comments in response to your very insightful input that will take us to the bottom of the hour, 12:30, just 10 minutes of an engagement with your input. I would like to welcome now our participants in the room just to engage with what we've just heard. I'll wait for hands. If not, I'm happy to make it an open space. If you'd like to come in, please do so. If you feel more comfortable engaging via the chat, please do so again. I'm not seeing any hands to my co-chairs. Please just let me know if I'm missing anything. I'm just like having an overview of various things at the moment, but there are no questions emerging. So I guess silence is consent. So we agree with what we've just heard, but it seems there is a question or a comment from Mtulisi. Please come in.
Good morning, everyone. It's actually afternoon now. It's Mtulisi from Nelson Mandela Bay Municipality in Port Elizabeth. I was quite intrigued by the right to housing that the professor is raising. And we all know that obviously everyone has got a right to housing, but what intrigued me the most is the additional rights that he says someone can probably exercise as well, in terms of the choice of the house, as well as the choice of the location. So what I want to just check is that, can anyone raise that right to a point that they can actually take legal action to whoever is supposed to provide housing for them? Say if it's a government institution that is supposed to do that. Can someone raise that point to a point of even taking, say, the government to court, where they're saying, the house that I'm being given is at a location that I don't want, and it's in the form that I would not really appreciate? Thank you.
Thank you for that, Mtulisi. If anybody else would like to come in with a question, perhaps we can allow Prof to respond to a couple of questions at once. Please come in, Krishan, and followed by Uyanga again. Thank you.
Hi, Madam Speaker, and hi to Professor. Thank you very much for allowing us to be a part of this group and this space. I'm not sure if you can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you loud and clear.
Okay, no problem. So just I seek your apologies and pardon in advance for my type of questioning, but I'd like some sort of knowledge on it. So directly in response to the area of Zimbabwe, we understand that there are lots of issues in terms of funding and stuff and finance for tackling most of these issues, according to Professor's presentation, there are various aspects that he had pointed out on that touches to the heart of inclusivity. So I'd like to know, how does that region actually manage to gather finances, and what kind of funding streams do they have that actually tackles all of these issues that he has presented, or how about they actually, what kind of methodology do they have in dealing with these kind of issues? Thanks.
Thank you. And Sianga, you may come in and then we'll take those 3 questions and see if there are any others post that. Yanga, would you like to come in?
Oh, thank you. Yes, thank you. Prof, I'm just interested in knowing, in terms of the research that you've been conducting, and this question is referring in particular to the slide where you presented that 4-quadrant relationship that, you know, between inclusivity and, I think, accessibility, affordability, sustainability, and resilience. And I was wondering, to what extent have you found in your research, to what extent is inclusivity ever considered in relation to belonging when it comes to housing? I don't know if my question is clear.
No, quite clear. So the nexus
Wonderful.
between inclusivity and belonging.
And yes, in the arena of housing.
Okay, perfect.
Yes.
And then, Prof, if we can just take one more question emerging in the chat here from Nobukosi Ngwenya, who is asking, so related to the point that Mtulisi and yourself, Prof, raised, would the sites and services scheme be a better mechanism to help people not only realize their right to housing, but also access the type of housing that they want or need, and in the locations that they desire? And I think Tulisi raised quite an interesting one, to the extent to which people are able to legislate in regard of, and who is responsible and who could those grievances be taken to, in regard of realizing the right to housing in its deeper senses, in terms of what it's supposed to unlock. Housing not just as shelter, but as something that can give to other aspects of well-being, such as belonging, as Usisianga has said, and so on. So I'll leave it to you, Prof, just to consider those inputs, those questions and comments in whole. Welcome.
Okay, thank you, Chair. I'll briefly just go through these issues because I don't think that it is possible to exhaust all the issues at stake here. So I'm also quite intrigued by the issues on legality. So my initial response is that once something is a right, okay, once something is a right, then there should be processes to take legal recourse. What the issue is now this quadrant that I brought up. So if you access it, are you able to afford it? You know, so those two for me are really critical. And what normally happens is that the local authority may say, okay, the type of housing that you want is in location A, and this is the cost of the land, this is the cost of servicing. If you're able to afford it, you should have it. So I still maintain that you can challenge and you can take local authorities to court. And I would like to see more local authorities taken to court, because what they actually do is that when they provide housing, especially in our case here, even if it's high density, it's almost the same size with the same requirements. And you know, it's like you are developing a homogeneous community. And what we find is that it's not, because there are people with special needs and with special interests. I'm not a lawyer, but what I would say is that there should be provision. There should be this ability for people to raise issues with the local planning authorities and say, it's not just the able-bodied that we are looking after. We're also looking after people with disability. And we have to be seen to be trying to understand and address their requirements for services, as it were. So I think the issue is still out there. There was also the issue about funding. So when you track the history of Zimbabwe, when we got independence, there were so many building societies that came up. And what they were supposed to do was to make it easier for people to get mortgages, for example, to build houses on already serviced land. Due to the economic challenges that were faced for the past 25 years or so, it has become very difficult, even for the building societies, to provide finance for housing. So what you see happening more and more is that people are building out of their own pockets. And what this means is that it's taking much longer for someone to start a house and to complete it. So the situation, I think, unless our economy improves, and it's a big if, I think we still have these challenges in terms of financing. The government has also come up with very ambitious programs. I think in 2013, they wanted to build 2 million housing units. I don't think they even built 50,000 of the housing units that they planned for, because the resources are simply not there. And then the issue about inclusivity and belonging is also an interesting one. And I think what we have to do perhaps is not only to look at the economics of it, but to talk about the social issues and the cultural issues that underpin inclusivity. So when you talk about belonging, you are saying, when I'm in a certain area, in a certain housing estate, I must feel that I'm part of it. But the issue is much more complicated than that, because we are also now talking about how we are socialized as individuals and as communities. But I think it's an interesting point to try and further research into. How do we make sure that it's not only inclusive, but you also get the sense of community, which I think the issue of belonging is trying to address. My final reaction is that the issue of site and service schemes is I think is an option. We did a paper with Profs Chipungu and Magidimisha on densification, for example. And the idea was to try and reduce the stand sizes, reduce the sprawl, but perhaps make it easier for people to be able to access housing at a much cheaper cost. So, Madam Chair, I don't have all the answers, but these are some of the issues that I can bring to the platform for the time being. Thank you very much.
No, thank you very much, Prof. Of course, you don't have all the answers, but I think you've given us enough to chew on and to consider when we think about this aspect. And I think you are dovetailing very well into our next input from our esteemed Dr. Rosemary Hayanga. Ma'am, you will excuse me if I've mispronounced your name. I'd like to invite Dr. Rosemary Hayanga now, who will give her input that looks at the planning dilemma in upgrading of informal settlements in South African cities from a practitioner's perspective, really delving into the inclusivity paradox. So what has emerged for the other inputs and the discussions that have come up in the room is that inclusion is about the hard and the soft stuff. It's about the hardcore delivery of brick and mortar structures to drive inclusion in cities, but it's also about things that are softer and intangible, issues such as belonging. And so how do you build that into a robust program of housing delivery where we are conscious that it is about more than just the structure, but it gives to other things. It gives to belonging, shelter as somewhere where you can rest, build a family and form connections. And so I'd like to invite yourself now, Dr. Hayanga is a specialist in settlement planning, housing, placemaking, neighborhood development, who has worked in different countries around the region, including Botswana, Kenya, South Africa and Rwanda, and has a long experience in teaching and heading the School of Architecture and Housing, and as a senior lecturer at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, who is quite experienced in teaching in the areas that I've mentioned at the university level. And without further ado, I'd like to invite you now, Doc, to give us your input.
Okay, good afternoon to everybody. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay.
Okay, there was a bit of an echo with your sound. Let us try that again. It looks like you have muted yourself. If you could please unmute.
Okay, am I unmuted now?
We can hear you now, ma'am. Thank you.
Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes, we can. Thanks.
Can you see my screen? Hello? Hello?
Yes, Doc, we can see your screen. If you could just go into slideshow mode.
Okay.
The floor is yours. You may proceed.
Okay. What I'm going to do, I'm going to use my phone because my laptop is showing that my internet is unstable. So I don't know whether you are hearing me or not.
We can hear you, but whatever is comfortable for you, that will enable you to participate. But so far, we are able to see your screen and we can hear you.
Okay, thank you very much for this opportunity. When I thought of this particular topic, I have been wondering Ghana and seeing what is happening in the cities in South Africa. You look at the upgrading of informal settlements, and it is like a losing battle because they continue to expand. So
Sorry, I think the audio is cutting off.
Yeah. Doc, if you can hear us, we've lost your sound, although we can still see your screen.
hello?
Hello, we can hear you again.
You can hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now, but we had lost you for a moment there, but we can hear you again. Please continue.
Okay, okay. Then I think I will do more of speaking, and the presentations will be made available. So I was talking that I will start from the premise that we all appreciate the challenges of informal settlements in the country.
Recording in progress.
Hi, Doc. If you are using your cell phone and the computer, please mute one device that you're not using to speak on. For an example, if you're going to speak on your phone, please mute your computer so that we don't get an echo.
On the laptop, so I will use it. But if there's a problem, then I will go back to my.
You can mute the laptop and speak on your phone.
Sibu.
May I propose that we try to take the next input and then we'll come back to yourself, Doc. Let's just toggle around and see how we can work around the technical issues. Or do you feel comfortable to continue?
Hello.
Hello, Doctor. We can
I
hear
think
you.
I will just use my phone and forget
Yes.
about the line because it is creating a lot of interruption.
Yes, that will be fine. Please continue.
Yes. So I will just go straight in and talk about, I wanted to give the historical background, etc., to the challenges of informal settlements in the country. But we know that the dilemma has been created by the historical outcomes in the way in which planning has been practiced, which has resulted into social injustice that persists in the country. And it is a legacy of the apartheid era, which so far the planners have not been able to deal with. So one can argue that finding a solution to informal settlement upgrading has been elusive, and it is a task which the planners need to interrogate. Because as we know from the dilemmas is, the Africans were really not allowed to move into the city. They didn't really have the rights to the city. With the independence now, post the apartheid era, we have access to the cities. And what has happened? We have more and more of the Africans coming into the cities. And so we cannot assume as planners that informal sectors are not staying. They are here to stay. So as such, we have to contend with expanding informal settlements, both in terms of scale and size. And their informal settlements are occurring in a number of places, some inappropriately. So it really requires the planners to interrogate the approaches and the strategies that have been adopted in the upgrading of informal settlements. So you find the dilemma that the housing policy indicates, rather encourages, that we should do in situ upgrading. But you look at it and say, okay, this upgrading, how is it really being done? Are the planners really engaging with the upgrading of informal settlements or in the preparation of the plan? In most cases, you find that the planners and the local municipalities, the upgrading of informal settlements plans are outsourced. And when you attend many of these meetings, the planners be included, we are kind of silent. They're not really taking a critical view. So you find that the upgrading of informal settlements is being financially driven and plans are sourced. So whose vision is it that is being implemented? Is that why we are failing to make a real, genuine indent? That is a dilemma. Then the other one is, you look at the approach, you begin to question or interrogate. Is planning powerless to ensure that they make an impact such that the plans being produced are able to be useful? For instance, you find that more than 80% of the plans prepared, the upgrading plans prepared, are not implemented. Why are they not being implemented? They could be, you can theorize. There are many reasons. In the instance, if they are funded from the state, then their finance is available. So why are we failing? There are a myriad of possibilities, but from the planning perspective, there seems to be a gap. Planning needs to take its central position so that we ensure that the plans that are being generated are indeed taking a planning perspective, which we talk of integration, but when you look at the upgrading plans, they are not really integrated into the system. But it depends on what you are talking about in the connection of inclusivity. Okay, people can have access to water, but is that inclusivity? To the other person, it might not be. So you also find the situation of development control. You have a dilemma. You really sympathize and you want to improve the lives of the community. But suddenly they are using the road reserve. Do you move them or do you not move them? A simple example, we can look at what's happening in some parts of Mayville and along the streets. And you begin to question, is development control, has it given up? What is the future of our cities? You also have the dilemma that you have informal settlements taking place underneath main power high voltage lines. And you begin to ask yourself, what is going on? Then you find that the planner is in a dilemma. We have the social historical perspective, you have the political perspective, you have the pressure group of the civil society. Where is the voice of the planner? Okay, we know they are the anti-invasion units, etc., but those are really focused in minor components. So slowly, in my view as a practitioner, I can see that there is indeed a dilemma. How do the planners proceed? I don't have an answer, but I can only theorize that if we continue to lose control of our cities, then we shall have a problem. The other issue which I was looking at is the unintended consequences of policy implementation. Like we encourage upgrading where the people are in situ upgrading, but in a number of cases, they're most inappropriate. So if plans are being prepared by non-planners, you will find that the easiest way is just to say, okay, we shall upgrade. And then you are arguing that, okay, if you upgrade where you are, that is making it inclusive. So there are challenges in the loss in development control. We need to question as planners, where is the position of the development control? And what is the future of our cities in the next 10 years with our informal settlements, which we are upgrading? Where will they be? And then the issue is the inclusivity paradox to the planner. You want to be with a community, you are upgrading, we are saying you have sustainable livelihoods, but when you look at those settlements, are they sustainable? What is maybe you can say, okay, we will only be here for 5 years, but in most cases, some of the informal settlements have been existing for decades. So you have the challenge as the planner that how is it that you should be able to approach the various issues? If we look at South African context, the legislation had been used so negatively to suppress. So when we say that we have like schema and we require certain standards, you are at the dilemma. How do you proceed? So it is indeed a paradox. So a lot really depends on how the attitude of the planner, the attitude of how planners need to take their space. Because I've asked myself and I'm looking at that, my ideas of what a planner was 10 years ago is totally different from what it is now. And suddenly within the South African context and in the informal settlements, knowing most of our people need shelter, how can we ensure that upgrading of informal settlements leads to indeed sustainable cities? Indeed, you lead to improvement in the quality of life. And where do we really locate these upgraded settlements? You find that the planners themselves are not engaging but are outsourcing. So the key thing is not really the critical analysis of where you locate, but it is, okay, these people need water. So it's really a dilemma. Which will be your priority? So in my view, we cannot have a one service fits all, which is the current situation. But I feel that it is time that the planners came back and look at how do you rationalize the politics, the social components, how do you ensure that the upgraded settlements, you are taking into issues of climate change? So it's really, we require a multidisciplinary approach, and the planners should lead preparation of upgrading of informal settlements. At the moment, this is in quotes. I'm seeing that we are losing the battle because it appears that planners are becoming voiceless. So my idea today is to be provocative and to get the planners to react and all the other people, because I believe that we have challenges. If you have, I'll give an example where I was really conflicted. Port Elizabeth Airport, the shares a fence with an upgraded informal settlement. So you look at it, okay, we have improved the quality of life of these people. But in the final analysis, either you will move the upgraded informal settlement or you will relocate the airport. Because of the security, you can actually hit a plane if you are in that airport. Therefore, that is a conflict. Which one comes first? Is it short-term gain and short-term political mileage? Or do we really need at times as planners to say, no, let us look for an alternative site? So there are a number of examples which I could still bring it, but my key issue is the planners need to seriously interrogate as professionals the upgrading plans which are being prepared in terms of credibility with clear criteria, in terms of integrity, in terms of validity, because when you look at some of the plans, you really have to query whether planners engage with the document. And also in the context of, are they flexible? Are they adaptable? What are they really looking at undertaking clear proximity analysis to infrastructure, etc. So my challenge is that the planning needs to come up and to have a voice. It should be reflected in improved living conditions and in implementable, sustainable upgraded plans. I think that is all that I would like to say and leave people to interrogate, because I've made a lot of allegations and suppositions. But I would not want to say that this is a hopeless situation, but it's a field where we need to interrogate and discuss and see what models of planning we can come up with to ensure that our cities indeed become sustainable. The chair, can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am, we can hear you.
Okay, because I cannot see what is happening and I cannot use my my laptop.
No, we hear you loud and clear. Such insightful provocations. We can't wait to engage. Please continue.
One thing which I wanted to look at is also the issue of the COVID and informal settlement updating plans. It is created an area where we need to query the health equity, look at disease patterns and upgrading of settlement. Look at, are there any norms which we are really following? And when we talk about sustainability, hunger and COVID was massive. What do we do? How are we relating in the context that technology is changing and we need to adapt? Where will our people be when there is COVID, there is hunger, and most of the sustainable livelihood programs which are indicated in the upgrading plans tend to be tokenism and not really genuinely sustainable. So then I came up with some criteria which I've not included here. I can't show it, but criteria, we need to have a criteria. It can't be uniform, but each sector should be unique. And we cannot just use the policy level at the national. Policy level at national will guide us. But when we are interrogating a plan at the neighborhood level, the local level, where indeed you are having communities, people occupying road reserves with the serious consequences that we know, we really need to come out and know that any decisions that we take we are to think of the pandemic. Knowing, of course, South Africa had suffered plague, etc., in the some years, but now we have COVID. What are going to be the new standards that we are going to adopt to ensure that we have flexible plans? Thank you, Chair.
Thank you so much, Doc, for that in-depth and provocative input that you have just given. You ask a very, very critical question, and you pose something quite specific about the role of planners, what is within the purview of planners, how are they empowered, and how are they constrained to make radical change and drive transformation. You also talk to what interventions could be going on at the hyper local level that are inclusive of the people in those spaces. And I think it links quite well to what has emerged from the other inputs, where we are considering to what extent what we are implementing, what people want, and to what extent can people be involved in the co-creation and collaboration towards coming up with human settlements and human settlement solutions, and particularly in the space of upgrading of informal settlements. How can we collaborate with people in situ who have the local knowledge, who have a very clear idea of what it is that they want? And so how can governance and implementation be more collaborative and co-creative? And I think you've given us a great provocation for us to go into a discussion for the next 10 minutes. Now, I would like to invite some impressions and reactions to Doc's input, and we'll take it from there. So please feel free to raise hands, to also pose your questions through the chat. And yeah, so let's spend the next 10 minutes really engaging with what we've had. Welcome, everyone. I don't see any hands at the moment. And so I'll take silence as consent, and I will unilaterally perhaps even abuse my position as chair and facilitator in this room to ask my own questions. But yeah, please do take the opportunity to engage on this wonderful input that we've just heard. Okay, colleagues, in the interest of time, I'll give us perhaps just one or two more opportunities to pose questions. If not, with your permission, I will ask for us to move on. Perhaps you can just keep those questions on hand. Perhaps we will open the opportunity to perhaps pose them after the next speaker has had the opportunity to do this. So we're quite open to taking inputs directed at Doc and at the next speaker. If I may, I would now like to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Thembiso Mieni, who is a senior lecturer in the field of housing, and was a research associate within the Saki Chair in Applied Poverty Reduction Assessment in the School of Built Environment and Development Studies at UKZN. He's a principal investigator for human settlements, decision support tools, and the Municipal Innovation Maturity Index Research Project, both funded by the Department of Science and Innovation at the national level. His current research interests include issues of poverty reduction and subsidized housing programs in South Africa, with a focus on the role of local government in the implementation of housing policy and the convergence of modern traditional structures and formal and informal institutions in the provision of housing in rural areas. Today, he is set to give us an input looking at the precarity of affordable housing, expanding the concept both conceptually and in terms of policy, expanding the framework for affordable housing in South Africa. Without further ado, I'd like to invite you, Dr. Sthembiso Myeni, to come and give your input. We'll take questions directed to you, together with those directed to Dr. Hayanga, after you've had the opportunity to speak. Please come in, just in the interest of time. We'll take your input for 20 minutes and spend time on discussion.
Good evening, colleagues. Thank you so much, Chair, for an opportunity, but also in the interest of the, because of the network connectivity, I may request to only use the mic for now in my presentation. Let me start by saying what has transpired in actual sense for me to come with this topic in terms of precarity and affordable housing, in terms of expanding the conceptual and the policy framework. Just an ongoing work which we are currently working on in terms of geographies of youth, because we're a bit concerned about these geographies of exclusion and also youth transition also to this. But also, I think it has been inspired by the very same fact that if you, I think last week, if I'm not mistaken, the South African government somehow through its sector departments, they were launching science innovation and transformative technologies for sustainable human settlement roadmap. What comes out very clearly, more particularly to that, has also been the question about the demand for housing, for government-sponsored housing, more particularly in South Africa, which seems to be increasing, more particularly if you compare from 1994, where we are sitting at 1.5 million, 2011 sitting at 1.9, and 2017 we're sitting somewhere around 2.3 million. But there were also other opportunities in terms of housing provision to that, which in terms of the figure, it's sitting somewhere around 4.7 million. But at the same time, if you look at the cost of addressing housing backlog by 2020, I think the state will have required somewhere around 800 billion to be able to address that, but only to find that in the budget of 2018 to 2019, human settlement, including other aspects, we're only having a budget of 56.5 million. But if you look at the sector department budget, you find that in terms of the medium-term expenditure framework allocation, they're only sitting around or somewhere around below 15 billion. Below 15 billion. Now you ask a question in terms of how then will they be able to provide? Are we going to, at any point, be able to reach a situation where we really deal with the issue of housing there? So with that context, in actual sense, what I've decided to do, that's why I've decided to come more particularly with this concept of what we call precarity to this, because there's quite a lot that is happening. So on the basis of my presentation, I'll be very quick in terms of covering what is the purpose. So in actual sense with the purpose, it's more of starting a discussion around this, more particularly on the basis that there's less that we could find, more particularly in our discipline, and also to look at the origins of precarity and head on to a theoretical framework that is framing our thinking around this, which is more about biopolitics and governmentality, and thereafter head to the conclusion to that. As I've already indicated, that the paper in actual sense seeks to introduce and discuss the concept of precarity, and conceptually position it within the space and housing debate in South Africa. But also, as we are working in different spaces, then we may need to also introduce a research agenda on precarity in housing, more particularly because some studies are showing that there is less that you may find, more particularly in the global South. So therefore, with this, then I will argue more particularly to this presentation that precarity of households is increased where the state delays the delivery of housing and landlord increase rents to capitalize on the chronic undersupply of housing. I know that in the literature on housing, which is linked to poverty reduction, there is a limited coverage of multidimensional aspect of poverty, but whilst also in this case, we argue that precarity could be useful analytical lens for engaging some of the questions or some of the challenges that we are experiencing. I think the previous speakers, they've been engaging some of the challenges that we are experiencing, more particularly in the housing space. But if you look globally, without having to mention more particularly issues around your SDGs, the right to housing, but if you look globally, more particularly, there's been some studies which have been conducted, more particularly soon after what we call the recession or the financial crisis, which took place somewhere around in previous years, decades ago. So what has happened was that there's been no comparative measurement when it comes to what we call housing precariousness, which has also been very important because what you'll also come across to that has been the challenge that it looks like everyone in actual sense is in a dilemma when it comes to the issue of housing, because if you look at housing payment areas, you may find that this is not only the problem that will always affect the poor, but it also affects even the middle class, if one has to put it that way. But also what is important, as I've already indicated, that with housing precarity, you'll find that it's less developed, but therefore we need to, despite that there's been an increase across Europe since the financial crisis then. But now with the COVID-19 also, you may find that it has already been in a position to also exacerbate some of the challenges that were already existing, as you could also see in some of the employment literature, you also come across that. So what is also important also to this, with this concept of precarity, we've got a strong assumption that it can contribute to the understanding of everyday experiences and housing pathways of individuals, more particularly those encountering chronic, acute, gradual, and sudden, and also uncertain and insecurity in their housing situation. But also at the same time, it also introduces one to also be able to understand the relationship between structure and agency, which allows an understanding of both structural influence and also constraints on housing income people. But also, you need to also have an understanding that precarity in itself, when you want to engage it, you need to have a view of overlapping nature of other dimension of precarious living, including employment, but also crucially to what we also define as for low income people. But also, I was very happy about what the other previous speakers spoke about in terms of the question around accessibility and affordability, because it's not only precarious housing condition, not only related to losing one housing entirely, but it's also about the quality of housing and also access to other essential services. There you can have a house, but also if we are not in a position to also be able to afford, then it's another question also in relation to that. So therefore, with that said, then a number of scholars, more particularly the likes of Lombard, has been able to engage more particularly precarity, more particularly in housing studies, but also at the same time, if you look at the very concept, as I said, it's one way of starting a discussion. Precarity in actual sense, it also provides a method of inquiry in terms of opening up the question of how precarious labor, precarious life intersect in particular times and also in places. But what is also important around the debate when we are also inquiring in terms of that, then it's a matter of then how do you shift some question in terms of what is, in terms of precarity is what it does in most cases, because there's a huge debate more particularly about precarity if you then follow the literature around the labor market. So what is also important around this then is also a question that the very same concept of precarity there's a diverse literature and also which has been accumulated over the years, but those who are familiar with will know the likes of or the work of Perry Bourgeois and also Guy Standing as an economist on the basis of some of their publications that they've come up with, where those who are affected by precarity, then they've then tried to define them as new dangerous classes, but also some of the other authors like Judith Butler is also of the view that precarious life and the power of mourning and violence in actual sense, what it means is that we are all affected by precarity in one way or the other, but it depends where you are. But when you are reading the work of these scholars, then you come across a very interesting aspect that the three of them are having distinct meanings of the term precarity, in a sense that, as I've already indicated, that it's a concept that somehow emerged in labor in employment literature. So precarity, they look at precarity as labor, precarity as class category, and also on the basis of ontological experience. If you also engage the work of Giddens to that, you can be able to come across that. But also at the same time, the very same concept for those that are tracing its emergency also, they are of the view that it also contributed to what we call a radical political activity platform, which has been adopted by some of the social movements in Europe. But also at the same time, even if you conduct some of the studies around, you look at some of the studies around the US, you can also come across the very same that there were also other movements, the likes of Not in My Backyard, Yes in My Backyard, which also has been part of that. But what is also important also here, when you are looking at these studies, they also take us back to say, the issue of precarity is not something that is new if you take the genealogy of this then. So it has been part of the discussion somewhere around concept, using the concept of marginality and the concept of informality, as other colleagues have also spoken about, but also at the same time, the issues around exclusion, which has become popular more particularly. But what it means then, it means that precarity may not, or is not the problem only of the global south, but it's also a problem that is also facing the global north in one way or the other. As I've already indicated in one way or the other, that the very same concept has originated from labor studies. But as I've said, that it's time now, maybe we can also be able to use it in housing, more particularly since others have been or are trying to use it in the other way, in the other part then. But also some will then argue and say precarity has been used as a tool for risk privatization, where employers, in a sense, redirect all cost and risk to workers then. But what it means is that precarity represents a lack of power, because you are vulnerable of human existence and also uncertain in life. And then this lack of power and resources within the society reduces the ability to live safe and have access, adequate housing, and also to fulfill your daily needs. Then you'll find yourself then being affected then at a later stage. So in actual sense, for me to be able to interrogate and also to try to expand this conceptual frame of this in our context, then I applied the work of Foucault in terms of the theory of governmentality and also biopolitics, with an intention to also understand how then the issues around knowledge and also the issues around how then power is also exercised. But also at the same time, there's also been a question of other scholars who are also looking at the of how then it's rendering technical support, but also at the same time, how then information is also more assembled also to this. But what is also important here is that when you look at this conceptual frame, more particularly governmentality, it's mostly concerned about the relationship about discourse and practice, which will always come across, but also at the same time, how then it encourage people to consider power, not only in terms of hierarchy, top-down power, but also the kind of power that enters the form of what we call the social control in disciplinary institution, and also as well as the form of knowledge. Then I think some of the other colleagues, when I was listening at their presentation, I think there's something around it that they were also talking about, but also the question about how then the issue around the production of knowledge and also certain discourses, which are now, you'll find that they are also internalized amongst people. But also then the other concept also very important is that of biopolitics in terms of what will then define as the intersectional field between human biology and politics, which now it works more about how then the administration of life, locality, population, and subject to ensure and to sustain and to multiply life, to put it in order, because in actual sense, what it means is that at one way or the other, people will need to be governed. Either you govern them from a distance, of which I think the previous presentation was more about that, the question about the institute upgrading, how then do you govern those people? So it's part of those particular debates, but also some post-colonial theories will also view biopolitics as a means which that of colonizing forces, and also in terms of how you regulate and control the movement, or in terms of the subject. But I will also explain some of this as I proceed. So the approach that one was taking also to this, as this is still at a conceptual frame in actual sense, has always been about that when you are looking at precarity in actual sense, in as much as one can be able to use the positivist approach to this, or the positivist paradigm to this, but in most cases, the constructive paradigm is very important to follow that, but also at the same time, as I've already indicated, that has also been multiple theories to try to understand this in terms of biopolitics and also governmentality then. So as indicated, I've been reviewing much of these housing policies, more particularly in South Africa, and also some of the other policies also outside outside the housing discipline. So what is so important when you look at this more particularly is that precarity is not only affecting, because we've got a tendency to think that only the poor people who are affected in most cases. So in this case, precarity cuts across social classes in various domains. It can be at work, your livelihood, and also your income in most cases. So because there are instances where you'll find that the poor cannot afford housing, or those who cannot afford housing are subjected to various insecurities of housing. Then in other instances, you'll find that they are pushed out of the formal spaces to the informal or in the margins of the city. Then the question is, when you talk about inclusive city, what do you mean if then at the same time people will find that through this formalized marginalization, then you find that they are in one way or the other, they are voluntarily taking themselves out of the city because of the fact that maybe somehow they could not be able to fit, they cannot be able to to afford maybe to be on the city. That is why then we are saying there's a reproduction of housing precarity, or in actual sense, precarity, you may find that it is also reproduced on the basis that of those insecurities, which are always pushing people out of the city. But at the same time, if you look...
Sorry, Doc, you have just a minute to wrap up.
Oh, okay. Okay, so what the also other issue around this is an issue about this, what we call the racial geographies of affordable housing. So what we also find out is that classes who are entering what we call the housing market, in most cases, they are subjected to various tactics, more particularly of capital accumulation in one or the other. Just like if you look at some studies around the US and so forth, the first generation of what we call the middle class profession, they found it very difficult, more particularly to enter into the housing market, because there were also other groupings which were also a blockage, more particularly to that then, because they are always pushed to the issue of renting. But as I said, that it's a matter of how then do we start this discussion, because some of these may find that they are not that much recorded, more particularly because we only focus on policy rather than to also cover other things. But also at the same time, with those movements which are emerging in the name of affordable housing and also being affected by precarity, you'll find that is what we call the formation of loose assemblages, in a sense that those, because some of these professionals will find that they are skilled workers, but they are finding it very difficult to enter the housing market. So somehow you find that they form these loose assemblages with the developers and so forth, with an intention to advocate for urban redesign, and also how then there should be a conversion of housing technologies with an intention that they should be part of the city. But then just in conclusion then, what we find happening is that there is a way in which one could be able to apply and also to try to understand these governmentality and also biopolitics, because you become exposed to various technologies which are put in place to various classes in order to manage themselves in other instances. That's why we talk about the technologies of management of self, which leads some of this to be subject, even if they're having what we call the aspiration then. But just to conclude, I think studying affordable housing through the lens of precarity can lead to policy reform somehow, because that will also allow a greater understanding of affordable housing in terms of affordable housing for who, because at the same time, there are also questions around who are the precariat, more particularly in housing, and also who are at the risk of housing within the context of affordable housing, and also within the context of inclusive city. So I will end there for now. Thank you so much, Chair.
Okay, thank you so much, Doc. You've also given us quite a lot to think about. I'm particularly interested in how you present this this concept of precarity, and I'm sure it's related but unrelated to the concept of vulnerability as something that could be a great lens at looking at different interventions, programs, things that are being implemented, and something that can inform us in terms of making sure that what we deliver is sustainable. I was also particularly interested in how you wove in the Foucauldian concept of governmentality together with, we called it biopolitics, and how that weaves in with very much a labor concept of precarity. And I think it also gives us a lot to think about in terms of the discussion. And with that, and with time in mind, we were supposed to end at 1:11. We are now edging closer to 1:30, and I'm hoping that we can move to a closing at around 1:35, with your permission, of course, everyone. And maybe let's just take a couple of minutes for discussion of the last two presentations, taking us to 1:35. And then I would like to invite my co-chair, Mr. Bemi Alalade, to also just give his impressions, and perhaps he can give us a way forward about, and also Ayobemi if he can, to give us a way forward about how we can access some of the very fruitful and insightful things and presentations that we've heard in this session, how we can take what has come up in discussion forward through this platform in the next 2 days, and if there will be an opportunity to engage again on these, perhaps how will they be taken back to plenary if there's a plan. I did see that in the chat. We were invited to join the plenary tomorrow again at 9. Perhaps there will be a review, and some of the insights that come out of this will be presented there. So I'll just give Ayobemi an opportunity to kind of guide us in terms of a way forward together with my co-chair. But I think before that, let's just take some time to consider the last 2 presentations. I welcome you now.
Yes.
To raise hands.
I mean,
Ayobemi, would you like to come in now in terms of a way forward and then take the discussion?
no, it's fine. You can just go ahead. I think Bemi Alalade is here.
Yes, he is.
Bemi can easily support. Bemi, please go ahead.
Yes, I'm here. Thank you very much, and thank you to all our presenters for these wonderful presentations that we've had so far. We want to thank you for taking your time to come up with all this research and for presenting it to us. I think we can also, because as we're doing this, I'm also watching to see if we have all these presentations on YouTube. We can always go back to the YouTube page for the school to see if there's any part of this presentation that is missed that we didn't really get. We can always go back to look at the videos. And I think tomorrow there's going to be a review of everything that is done today during the plenary, before we go into our different rooms for tomorrow. So if you have anything, if you have any contribution that you want to make, you can always send it to us through the chat box here, and we'll take it, we'll compile them together and present them tomorrow. Over to you, Dr. Pukwala. Oh, get now here.
Yes, so we've handed back to Ayobemi. If not, thank you for that guidance.
Let's just go to questions. If there's any questions that you want the presenters, the last 2 presenters to answer, you can please signify by putting it in the chat box, or you raise up your hand and we can call you to present your questions.
Wonderful, great idea. And thank you, Mr. Alalade, for your guidance as to how we will take the discussions of today forward into tomorrow's plenary. But as you have suggested, I think let's take some time to just engage with with the last 2 presentations. You are free to raise your hands and also place your questions into the chat.
There's a hand.
Christian with a hand there. Please come in, Christian.
Hi, presenter. Thanks very much. My question is directed to the last presentation. So I'd just like to say thanks very much to Professor for that presentation. It really was an excellent one, and I felt it was quite deep and insightful. My question is, there are lots of points that was brought out that actually takes you to the root cause of inclusivity, some of them being work-related issues, insecurity being a key one, the precariousness being a key aspect, very much was the heart of that presentation, which actually resonates with why exclusivity sort of takes place and stuff. But I would like to know how should government be responding, given that now some of the deeper aspects of it has come about. How should government actually respond, and how should even planners actually respond in trying to deal with this aspect? I'm a bit puzzled with providing some answers, but I'd like to know how should government actually respond in trying to avoid ordeal, especially in the with the advent of COVID-19, where so many people have lost their jobs, and would have been a key element to them moving out of cities and stuff. How should government then respond in trying to deal with this aspect of inclusivity? Thanks.
Thank you, Christian. Are there any other questions? It doesn't seem that there are any other questions. In the interest of time, I'll just open up for Dr. Mieni to respond on that one. I think if I may just also dovetail on Christian's very important question. I think mine that came from your input, Doc, was around how do we apply this precarity lens to the current context we're in that Christian mentions of COVID, and how the local state should respond. What does it mean in relation to affordable housing, the developments that are happening in the spaces of work in terms of the future of work, transitioning very much into a gig economy and so on. And so without hijacking Christian's question, I'd like to just dovetail on what he asked and to pose my own questions without abusing my position as facilitator and chair in this session. Thank you, Dr. Mieni. Please come in.
Thank you so much, Chair. I think the first question to look at, as I said, towards my conclusion, was who is affected, more particularly when it comes to the whole issue about affordable housing, because from where we're sitting, we all have got insecurities in various domains of life. But also to respond directly in terms of what the government should do, I do understand that what government will do will always be to give those tax breaks and all others then. But also on the context of COVID-19, I know that let us be very honest that market forces more particularly, in one way or the other, in as much as the government is able to negotiate with banks and so forth, but still then, even if that is the case, but it does not necessarily take away the fact that you still owing or you still have to pay. So some of those things you'll find that they're also giving us a bit of a problem. So in one way or the other, one will expect the government to have another form of intervention where there will be a relief, not a temporary relief to say that it postponed to the future then, because all what is happening, you'll find that they call it a relief, but it is therefore forwarded to the future in one way or the other. But also at the same time, if you look at our context in South Africa, as I said earlier, that there are a number of these programs, and we really accept those programs. But sometimes if you are influenced by the work of governmentality and biopower, you are likely then to also dispute, to say these programs are meant to control people from a distance in one way or the other. But at the same time, some of these programs will find that they are excluding the other pool, more particularly in the society, whilst in actual sense, everyone is affected. So those are kind of things I think we are sometimes battling with, because at the same time, even if you talk about poor people, so it's very difficult sometimes even to quantify who are those poor and all others. That is why when it comes to housing, you will always come across what we call a lot of challenges, your maladministration, your corruption, because housing has been, all the problems that we have in our society are compounded in housing. So that is why even in protest, you'll always come across the fact that there are dangerous classes and so forth. But at the gist of those protests, then housing is also a that then, because all the problems, either the problems of unemployment, the problems around poverty, the problems around inequality, they are compounded within housing. That is why then I think one has been able, let us now relook in terms of how then we can start to engage that. That is why then we're offering the concept that let's look at this concept of precarity in terms of how then to use it, because that in itself can also be able, as I was saying, in my conclusion, that maybe depending how we look at that, how we engage with that in terms of advocacy and so forth, one can be able to be in a position also to really look at how can we reform maybe our policies going forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Doc. We have another question from Uyanga. Please come in. And we'll take that as the last question and response, and then we will ask my co-chair to help us close the session. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I don't have really a question, I just have a comment. Dr. Mieni, I think your presentation was absolutely brilliant. I think it introduces a lens that has been missing in the discussions we've been having about affordable housing. And I'm not just talking specifically in this conference, but I'm talking generally when we raise issues of affordable housing. The fact that we always reduce affordable housing to an issue of abject poverty, and in so doing, making invisible so many other social classes, so many other social groupings who are not able to access affordable housing or not able to maintain their access to affordable housing. And as such, you have this, because of this precarity. So I think this concept of precarity is a brilliant lens that it allows us to have a much more broader take on in South Africa, given our specific history, given these racial geographies that you raised in your presentation, who really is in a precarious state, who really is poor. I think when you raise that issue of, how with this lens we're able to problematize, definitions of who's poor, who is unable to afford. When I think of how in the middle class, when you are buying a house as a Black middle class person, when you are buying a house in the suburbs, you face many obstacles. So despite perhaps having a secure income, and despite being classified as middle class because of your income, yet you have all these other obstacles or aspects of buying a house that actually make it difficult, and for many make it impossible. The fact that you have to pay transfer costs, for any house that's above 900,000, you have to pay these transfer costs. If you're buying a house just in a normal, reasonable, I'm not doing a high income suburb, just in a normal suburb, you are faced with transfer costs of about 100,000 rand, which means you are supposed to be having 100,000 rands in your bank account. This is at the very start of the process of purchasing a house. And so you enter that housing market as a Black middle class person with all the Black tax and all the other dimensions of our precariousness, and you enter with 100,000 already gone as part of your deposit, and then having to face up to this mortgage that you struggle to pay off because of all these other responsibilities that you have, that perhaps people in other or who have had a different history of social and economic marginalization history may not have. So I think this is brilliant, and I hope your research can be brought brought to the attention of policymakers. I think there are a lot of policies that can be designed. There are many interventions. Our government needs to be pushed to develop interventions that go beyond abject poverty because of the specific history of this country. So thank you very much. I found that extremely stimulating.
No, thank you, Yanga. I think you share all of our sentiments. I don't know if Dr. Mieni would like to respond on that particular one. But for myself, I think I would just like to say thank you to everyone who is in the room and for gracing this very spirited engagement. And thank you to all our speakers for their inputs. But I won't be long. I will hand over to my co-host, Mr. Demi Alalade, to actually formally close this session. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you very much, my chair. I just want to close on this note that I want to thank everybody for their participation. For everybody in this room, I want to thank you for taking time to join. and also for all our presenters. Once again, I want to say thank you. And I would like to remind you that tomorrow is another day, and the program starts at the same time, 9 a.m. tomorrow for the plenary session. Then before we start going into the different rooms for further discussions and for all the other things that will be done. And like I said, we'll have a review, a reflection of everything that we discussed today during the plenary tomorrow morning. So I just want to implore us to join on time, and I pray that God will keep us, and we'll meet you all tomorrow by God's grace. Thank you very much for your participation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.